In the cold waters of the North Atlantic, off the coast of Nova Scotia, Canada, lie two merchant marine shipwrecks lost during World War II. These wrecks, laden with valuable metal cargoes needed for the war effort, were thought to be lost and beyond reach of conventional dive recovery. Join the Sea Hunters as they dive and investigate these two shipwrecks and tell the story of an enterprising marine salvor who would risk it all to rescue precious cargoes from the depths of the ocean. With over 100 million books in print, Clive Cussler is the Grand Master of shipwreck tales and adventure. Director of the Vancouver Maritime Museum, James Delgado is one of the world's foremost marine archaeologists. With over 20 years wreck diving experience, Mike Fletcher is an internationally renowned professional diver. Leading the Econova dive team, John Davis has coordinated shipwreck searches around the globe. Together, they explore the planet's last frontier in search of true adventures with famous shipwrecks. They are the Sea Hunters.
Hello, I'm Clive Cussler. For years, I've searched the world for shipwrecks of historic significance, not for profit, but for the challenge of the hunt. It's a chance to step back into history and relive the stories surrounding the tragic loss of the ships, their passengers and crew, along with the incredible tales of the heroic divers who salvaged the ghostly remains. One such story concerns Risdon Beasley, the master of deep ocean salvage, an ingenious man who went beyond convention and found tremendous success at reaching down into the ocean's depths to snatch back precious cargoes once thought lost forever. Now join us as we dive to investigate two shipwrecks, the Russian transport ship Kolkoznik and the Swedish ship Kaparin. Both ships were salvaged by Risdon Beasley, where we can still find valuable cargo he left behind.
Throughout the First and especially the Second World War, the United Kingdom depended heavily on raw materials to maintain her war machine. Aluminum for the manufacture of planes and aviation parts, copper and tin to produce alloys for shell casings, and nickel for the production of stainless steel alloys used in a variety of products, from heavy armaments to pots and pans. One of the most important producers of some of these metals and alloys was Canada. Throughout Canada and other metal-producing countries, these raw ores were mined, then processed into ingots. The resulting commodity, along with wartime necessities from a host of other countries, could then be handled and assembled for mass export to England. Merchant ships laden with these valuable cargoes assembled in Halifax and departed in large convoys, venturing out into enemy-infested waters of the North Atlantic. Unfortunately, many of these shipments, as well as merchant shipping from all over the world, would fall prey to submarine attacks before reaching their intended destinations. By the end of the Second World War, the registry of all ships lost to enemy attacks was staggering. Single cargoes worth millions of dollars lay on the bottom, outside the reach of conventional salvage. They offered a fortune to anyone clever enough to claim them back. It would take an audacious Englishman to perfect a strategy for harvesting the wealth from these wrecks. His name was Risdon Beasley. Sea Hunters Mike Fletcher, James Delgado, and Clive Cussler gather to make preparations to dive two of the many shipwrecks Risdon Beasley salvaged.
It is an amazing record when you consider, how many wrecks that this fellow salvaged.
Upwards of 85.
85.
Yeah.
Nobody came close to touching that kind of a record. Benjamin Malafert, after the Civil War, probably did about 40, but that's, I know no one that accomplished what Beasley did, and particularly in deep water, too.
The two wrecks the Sea Hunters have targeted to investigate are the Russian Kolkoznik and the Swedish vessel Kaparin. Kolkoznik was heading to Halifax from Boston, loaded with various supplies for the war effort. Barbed wire, tanks, rubber tires, and the non-ferrous metals nickel, lead, and zinc, when it struck a rock and sank. The Kaparin sank after being rammed by another convoy vessel. Salvage records indicate that she was loaded with hundreds of tons of aluminum, copper, nickel, and various brass products such as shell casings and rod. The exploration of the Caparin at a depth of 76 meters will be the team's main focus.
This thing's loaded with strategic metals for the war effort, and a bunch of it's still down there. So we're going to really take a close look after the fact at Risdon Beasley's salvage, what he did, how he did it, and maybe answer the question of why some of this stuff was left.
The sea hunters travel to the coast of Nova Scotia, Canada, to the site of the two shipwrecks. Here, from this protected little cove just southwest of Halifax, they will venture out to the shipwreck site of the Caparin.
Months ago, while working with the Canadian Navy, we came upon a very interesting shipwreck. Research indicated it was the Caparin, and further research indicated that it had been salved by Risdon Beasley, a very, very interesting character in the world of maritime salvage. Luckily, we were able to procure a set of photographs which actually showed Risdon Beasley salvaging this particular shipwreck. The photos indicate exactly the kind of work that he did to get materials off this wreck. Today, we're going to dive this wreck, and we're going to take a look at Risdon Beasley's work from the bottom up. We'll look at the shipwreck and the condition of the wreck, see what he did to actually get to the materials in the hull, and then we'll look and see just how successful he was in getting these materials off the wreck site.
Mr. Beasley is far from the first to try to recover valuable goods from the ocean floor. Humankind has long had a fascination to go underwater. Part of the driving force that helped achieve this was the need to recover valuable property that had sunk into the unknown. Throughout history, daydreamers and visionaries have come forward to announce grandiose schemes to dive down and recover lost treasure. All too often, their lack of experience got in the way of success. In fact, the history of underwater exploration in general has been rife with strange and failed inventions, as well as imaginative successes. With the advancement of time and experience, practical inventions of science prevailed. By the early years of the 20th century, the standard dive dress had evolved into a proven and reliable system. In brass and copper helmets, lead boots, and canvas suits, man was exploring and recovering property from a realm that was once thought to be beyond reach. Even so, the practical depth of the working diver rarely exceeded a 69-meter range. Mike's helmet and support equipment is an adaptation of that earlier gear. Its lightness offers more mobility, and for his purposes, is equipped with a television camera and lights.
Whenever we dive deep, we always have to be sure about the equipment. And in the case of Caparin, that's in 250 feet, we have to breathe mixed gas instead of air. And the problem with the helium in the mixture is that it has a strange effect on my voice. We call it the Donald Duck effect. It's so bad that the surface people probably couldn't even understand what I'm saying when I'm on the bottom. But to compensate for that, we have a dive radio that lets the surface people modulate my voice so that I can be understood.
4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Okay, modulator's working good.
But Risdon Beasley, he didn't have to bother himself with any of this because he never used divers on Caparin. In fact, he never used divers on any of these deep water salvages that he did all around the world. At least he didn't use divers in the conventional sense.
In 1932, a flamboyant Italian lawyer named Giovanni Quaglia grabbed headlines around the world. Employing a remarkable salvage system, which involved an articulated diving suit, tons of explosives, and a mechanical grab, Quaglia recovered nearly 5 tons of gold, as well as a substantial amount of silver from the wreck of the ocean liner Egypt. By putting men inside these one-atmosphere diving suits, Quaglia's divers directed a grab that hauled the cargo to the surface from the then unheard-of depth of 120-plus meters. His accomplishment would open the door to competing salvers. While the general public marveled at the gold, Risdon Beasley marveled at the concept.
In the years before the Second World War, young Risdon Beasley inherited a yacht repair business in Southampton. He occasionally branched out and did a few small salvage jobs. Thanks to wartime sinkings, Beasley's business grew. The Admiralty appointed him manager of a salvage fleet for the British Navy and as their agent for salvage in the South Coast area. By the time the war ended, Beasley had gained both influence and equipment and was ready to expand his business to waters beyond the South Coast. Beasley was a shrewd businessman, and he was particularly interested in learning some of Quaglia's trade secrets. So he took the opportunity to observe and learn the Italian salvage methods by borrowing some of Quaglia's own employees for a job Beasley was in the midst of. Having a better sense of how Quaglia worked, Beasley then set out to travel the world to find and salvage shipwrecks.
Like Beasley, sea hunter and author Clive Cussler has also searched the world's oceans for shipwrecks. In 1979, Clive founded the National Underwater and Marine Agency, or NUMA, a non-profit foundation dedicated to preserving maritime heritage by locating and identifying lost ships of historical significance.
I've been around, all the world. I've looked in the Indian Ocean, for example, or a lot of places in the Pacific. But we found probably 60, 65 wrecks over a period of 30 years. If you don't have an exact position, then you have to go out and mow the lawn. And unfortunately, that's very time-consuming, and if you're not in the ballpark, you're not going to find it. So it's always nice to know if you've got a specific area that has a high degree of probability, but very rarely does it ever work out that way.
Even a wreck on the bottom of the sea has an owner. In most cases, that owner is the insurance company, which paid off on the loss of the ship and the cargo. With the threat of war, the insurance firms wanted to charge higher wartime rates. In order to guarantee an uninterrupted flow of goods from her allies, the Crown stepped in and took over the business of marine insurance, creating the War Risk Insurance Office. Knowing this, after the war, Beasley approached the British government with an audacious proposal.
Risdon Beasley went to London, where all the war risk insurance of the world was centered, and he said to the underwriters, "I'm British. I was on your side during the war, and this Italian Quaglia was on the other side, so why don't you give me all your contracts?" Well, they did. He was in the right place at the right time, and he was the right nationality. Thanks to all of this, he locked in a monopoly on the salvaging of these ships.
Are we good to go? Just give me a thumbs up, Jim.
We're all set here when you are.
Okay, here we go. Just make sure I don't fall backwards. Hey, Warren, why don't you set the radio now that I'm on full helium?
Okay, we've got you modulated now.
Everybody happy?
You're all set.
Okay, dropping down to the bottom. I just passed 200 feet, and I've pretty much lost all natural light here.
Based in the historic seafaring port of Southampton, England, Beasley's enterprise took his company from these quiet backwaters to the oceans of the world, creating a salvage empire. Today, his abandoned buildings and forgotten machinery lay silent. His base resembles a ghost town, a sad testament to its former glory, where men labored and ships unloaded recovered cargoes to be sold at market for millions of dollars.
Come on through anyway, Mike. It's go on through into the sitting room there.
Fergus Hines joined the company in 1970 as a hydrographer and quickly rose through the ranks to become a manager of cargo recovery. During his years with the company, he participated in the salvage of some of the most outstanding of the lost cargoes.
What Risdon Beasley was doing, if you take a broad enough view of it, was exploiting a non-renewable asset. These ships went down in wartime, and ships do not sink in peacetime fast enough to make a business out of recovering their contents. So we were only concerned, in practice, with World War losses. Now, the World War losses were in fact sunk by submarines, and where they were sunk in the middle of the ocean, the middle of the North Atlantic, where most of them went down, there's nothing whatever you could do. There's about 80,000 tons of copper down there, and it'll never, ever be cheaper to get that up than it will be to go and buy some stuff that's just been dug out of the ground somewhere. So one was only ever interested in the cargoes on the continental shelf, which are very limited in area, and they go down to about 600 feet, a couple hundred meters, say. And once you get there, you're then on the margins, continental margins, which go down very abruptly, so that the area of sea between, or seabed between 600 feet and, say, 1,500 feet is very small indeed.
Beasley's study of the records of shipping losses indicated that this band of continental shelf held enough wrecks to make the recovery viable. He would attempt to salvage the cargoes of sunken vessels, splitting the proceeds with the government. The government would not be required to fund the expedition. Beasley would assume all the risk. In return, he would keep the lion's share of any recovered cargo.
When Beasley started off, he had a selection of salvage craft that he'd acquired during the war, and he was able to take his pick from those and buy them and keep them, which he did. But after a few years, he realized that it would be better to design a ship specifically for cargo recovery that would be more efficient. And he had two built on the basic lines of a mid-water steam trawler of those days. One called the Twyford, which was the first one that was built, which is named after the village where Beasley lived, and the next one called Droxford, which was another village over. And these two are in fact the world's only purpose-built cargo recovery ships, and they did an amazing amount of work between them.
Up on the diver!
Okay, approaching bottom. Should be able to see it there, Jim. And, yeah, I'm on the engine.
Looks pretty broken up. These engines are standing clear. Looks like somebody's been ripping away at it.
Hey, this isn't a steam engine.
No, roger that, Mike. You've got nice big diesels there. I can see the rocker arms real clear.
We should, be just below midships. Is that right, Jim?
Yeah, you're right inside the motor casing, Mike. You're directly amidships. Mike, we're gonna move now. Let's head into the area, look, just behind the engine room.
This site is unbelievable. There's huge deck frames here and heavy plate. It's just cut like it's nothing. Hey Jim, are you seeing what I'm seeing?
Roger that, Mike. I've got, that looks like refrigeration machinery right there. I can see those coils. It's a pretty major refrigeration unit you're swimming over. Nice russicle formation on it too. That sure is suggesting Caparin to me, Mike. This is definitely a ship that has more than just a single reefer. There's some major refrigeration going on here.
Exactly, and that's what Caparin was built for. It's a refrigeration ship.
Salvage records stated that she carried over 350 tons of nickel and copper matte, 450 tons of aluminum ingots, 300 tons of various other alloys, as well as tons of shell casings and brass rod. Beasley specialized in the recovery of exactly this type of cargo.
Now what he was going for was commercial quantities of non-ferrous metals, which is to say lead and zinc and tin and copper, brass, that sort of thing. And the point was they had to be valuable, intrinsically valuable in themselves. They had to be carried in a big enough bulk to make the individual cargo worth recovering. And they had to be unspoiled by immersion in seawater. And we did go for gold a couple of times, but that wasn't the main basis of the thing. Shipments of gold, you know, sort of half a ton, are colossal and they're rare, whereas shipments of 3,000 or 4,000 tons of copper, in peacetime at any rate, are not at all rare, and they're worth more than the gold is. So it made much more sense to go for these large commercial cargoes.
Lyle Craigie Halkett, also of Southampton, spent 20 years with the Risdon Beasley Company. During his time there, he rose from deckhand to become one of the company's leading chamber divers. His garage resembles a museum of ship memorabilia and items recovered from salvage assignments. Especially interesting is the variety of metal ingots he has collected, items of cargo recovered from shipwreck sites all around the world.
Generally, we knew what to expect because by the time a wreck had been identified, the company would have the cargo manifest of that ship anyway. Now, you knew the stuff you were after could be copper, could be tin, depending on how the market was generally. In later years, it was always tin because copper, the price of that never really recovered very well, so tin was the best commodity we could go for.
People often think that tin is rubbish because they associate it in their mind with tin cans, which you just chuck away without a second thought. But in actual fact, it is a very valuable metal. Of all the commonly shipped non-ferrous metals, it is the most valuable of them all. Of the commonly shipped ones, it is. And the reason it is used on tin cans, of course, is it's inert. It doesn't react with the fruit juice or whatever it is you put in the can. And that is why, of course, underwater it survives indefinitely. So if you lose 200 tons of tin, there's 200 tons to pick up. It was 10 years ago enormously valuable.
As I swim over this wreck, I can see all sorts of items used for the war, but for the life of me, I can't figure out what these things are.
Mike, is the coiled material there, is that a light track for a half track or some kind of a tracked vehicle over?
Yeah, I'm sure you're right, John. That would make more sense. At first I thought they were coils of heavy machine gun bullets, but your idea sounds far more likely. Guys, what I really want you to see, as soon as I get my hose cleared here, what I really want you to see is just on the other side of this pile. What do you think of this? They're everywhere, thousands and thousands of them.
We're seeing off to the one side there, what looks like either spent munitions or shell casings that are ready to be packed.
All that empty brass.
Yeah, that's a lot of empty brass cases there over.
You can see they're everywhere. Thousands and thousands of them down here.
This is pretty incredible. I mean, they're all over, and it doesn't look like scrap. These are looking like they're in wooden boxes. What do you think, John?
It's looking like the shell cases are or were in wooden crates, Mike.
As if they were packed a little bit too neatly to be scrapped.
In fact, you can sort of see the remnants of the wood crates that held them at some point.
That does. It's a good close-up.
Absolutely, that's a great
Close-up there, Mike, and these clearly were in boxes at one point. Very interesting. I really believe these were going over to be packed and set up as complete ammunition pieces once they were in England over.
The continental shelf of North America and Europe is littered with wrecks of ships laden with industrial cargoes sunk by U-boats. Nevertheless, actually finding them proved most challenging.
The way Beasley started locating wrecks was the same as Sarima, which was to drag a wire over the seabed between a couple of tugs. Very inefficient, and he realized at once that he wanted a sonar, which was a militarily confidential piece of equipment, but he managed to get one out of the Admiralty, and later on got 2 or 3, and they made a tremendous difference. Now, the way the sonar worked, it was a searchlight set, which is to say it sent out a beam about 10 degrees wide, like a searchlight beam, which stepped around 5 degrees at a time until it got up to the bow, and then it was swung around onto the other beam and it stepped forward again. And it would send the sound out, and if it hit anything, a rock or a shoal of fish or a whale or whatever it is, it would send back an echo. And what you would do is to go and search for these things with a sonar is choose your box where you thought the thing was, and as I say, usually about 500 square miles, and run up and down at about 8 or 10 knots, say, 8 knots maybe, about a mile apart, just going a grid up and down. Now, if you know from the echo sounder, which is running the whole time, and also from the sonar man listening, that you're on a smooth, sandy seabed, and you know you're looking for a wreck that's 450 feet long, you're going to find it. That's a fact. You may go up and down this way and not find it, and have to crisscross it and go that way, but in a 500 square mile thing, you can expect to do that in about 6 weeks, and you'll find the wreck if it's there. Now, what causes the problem? You find dozens of other wrecks which are the wrong one.
Beasley was looking, in most cases, for larger shipwrecks than I do. A lot of the ironclads, for example, that we found from the Civil War were much smaller than even a Liberty ship. The Hunley, for example, was only 40 feet long. So our searches were considerably different from his. But there again, if you can come within any kind of a close proximity, you'll find it, unless the information is just very poor and it's 30 miles off from where it's supposed to be.
Once the shipwreck was found, the first key task was to moor the salvage vessel over the wreck. 6 anchors were placed around the circumference of the salvage site. By simply letting out or taking in the anchor cables, the salvage vessel could position itself precisely anywhere above the wreck site. The next order of business was to cut into the ship to gain access to the cargo holds.
We knew we'd need explosives. We had an idea after all the years we've been using explosives that we would need about 3 tons. 3 tons sounds like an awful lot, but that's the amount that was needed to completely open a wreck. And the type of explosive we used was just very, very basic submarine blast and gelatine.
The charges were fashioned into long sausage-shaped tubes and were placed at strategic points on the wreck. Proper positioning of the charges severed the deck from the hull. Explosives placed near the seabed along the bilge keel would cause the sides of the ship to collapse outward. After the blast, the ship would be opened up like a clamshell. Once the overlying cargo on the upper decks was removed and discarded, the heavier cargo of metal on the lower decks would be exposed and ready for salvage.
You can see the round turn of her bilge, and you can see right down there, right down to her first deck level. Really obvious here where she's been cut right in half, right down the middle, right across the deck. Clearly some very serious explosives being used here.
I see now you're moving past these beams.
Once the explosions had done their job and the hull lay open, the process of salvaging the wreck could begin. All movement and underwater operations of the salvage vessel were directed from below by an individual inside the observation chamber.
Certainly a fundamental part of the operation was the man in the observation chamber. We called him diver, and mostly they had been divers originally before they got into that game. But he used to get out in this 1 atmosphere suit. He wasn't under pressure at all, and he had a telephone, and he had some lights overhead, and he had some windows to look out of, and that was all his work was done with those facilities. And you depended on a good one. Someone with a lot of experience could just look through the murk at a half-seen wreck and tell you something about it, which a newcomer couldn't begin to do.
The only way to earn a place inside the observation chamber was to prove yourself over time.
You'd climb up and get inside the chamber, which was a bit of a squeeze anyway, and put your oral nasal mask on. Then they'd stick the lid on. The chamber would be swung over the side and lowered down quite gradually. And as it's going down, there'd be an umbilical for the telephone and for the lights, which would also be taped to the lifting wire. And when you got to a depth where you might start seeing the loom or outline of the shipwreck, you'd get them to stop everything, sort yourself out, in other words, feel comfortable, and then perhaps be lowered more gradually until you got a good sight of the shipwreck, and then you'd start to assess whereabouts you were and what you were looking at.
Once the observation chamber was in position, the individual inside could begin to direct the operation.
The main tool that was used for both opening the wreck up and then recovering everything that was in it was a grab. Very much like those little things you see on the fairground with 3 little spikes that'll pick you up a sweet or something if you're lucky. And this thing was a similar idea to that. It could pick up anything. It used to have, the legs came together and you could pick up a vast piece of deck plate or a bit of an engine or anything you like. It could rip winches off the deck and this sort of thing. It was, I mean, one of the biggest lifts it ever did was in the St. Lawrence. There was a cargo of copper with Churchill tanks overstowed on top. And these things weighed something over about 30 tons or something, I think. But the same grab that did that could pick up an ingot of tin, just one by itself. It was the most amazingly versatile thing.
If the visibility was good and was not too deep, obviously, we could actually be down there and could watch this big spider type thing coming down. Once the grab come down, it was quite easy to work because you had communications with the surface. You would tell them which way you wanted to move, 10 feet this way, 10 feet that way. And it was quite easy to move the ship to starboard, to port, to head or stern, whatever you wanted to do.
The operation relied primarily upon heavy equipment and machinery, requiring patience, skill, and expertise, which could only be obtained through experience.
While I was with Risdon Beasley at one time, I was flying from Southampton to Aberdeen with the director, Mr. Harvey. He was one of the later directors of the company. And we were about 1,000 feet in this helicopter. And he said to me, Lyle, if you look down below you, there's a house with a swimming pool in the garden. And I could see it was a lovely day. And I said, yeah, I can see it. And he said, well, can you imagine lowering a grab down there 1,000 feet inside that swimming pool, which looked about the size of a postage stamp? And I said, no, I don't know how on earth we managed to do that. There's certainly no textbooks. There's nothing written about how you would do it. It's just experience and very, very good men. Men who's been doing it for quite a long time, dedicated to it. Captains, salvage masters, excellent divers, seamen, even a good cook that kept everybody happy. You needed all those ingredients to get that grab in the right place.
Once the operation began, the process was repeated over and over. The grab would be lowered to the bottom, where it closed on the cargo and lifted it back to the salvage vessel's deck. The crew would sort through the recovered debris, and the ingots were separated out and stored in the hold. The process continued until the desired cargo had been acquired. At this point, the salvage director would call an end to the operation, and the vessel would either move on to the next wreck or return to port to discharge the cargo.
What Risdon Beasley's men were able to do using this system truly was remarkable. The equipment, really isn't designed to get every last ingot. And they expected to leave 15% of this very precious cargo behind. That was just the way it was. We now had an interesting opportunity. We had seen Caperin, we knew what was left behind. Only a few miles distant was the wreck of the Kakosnik, with one very basic difference. Kakosnik was more than 100 feet shallower than Caperin. That had opened the door for salvors to follow on the heels of Risdon Beasley. We were interested to see comparison between the two. And it was simple. All we had to do was fill some scuba bottles with some mixed gas and just dive down there and look around. We had quite a bit of time because it was so much shallower. And as soon as you get to the bottom on the Kakosnik, you see there is definitely a similarity. There was the distinctive Risdon-Beasley signature about both of these wrecks. The decks had been cut away, and right at the turn of the bilge, the sides had been cut so that they flopped out onto the seabed. But before Risdon-Beasley could do that, on the Kokosnik he had to physically lift several Army tanks off the deck that had been carried there as deck cargo. Those tanks had been lifted off by the grab and simply discarded on the seabed around the perimeters of the wreck of Kokosnik. And there they were. Some of them were upside down, some were still standing on their tracks, and some were laying on their sides. They were in Beasley's way, and he just simply moved them out of the way. And then swimming on, we were able to see lots of similarities between the two wrecks. The same kinds of materials that were used to feed the war machine were there, the rubber tires, the tracks for half-track vehicles. And then scattered everywhere amongst that material were these items that looked like beehives. And on closer inspection, they turned out to be rolls of barbed wire. And then I thought, of course, barbed wire is something that's needed at times of war, especially in the First World War, but to some extent the Second World War as well. And it took a bit of time, but by looking very closely, we were able to find the odd ingots of nickel, some lead, and zinc that had been left behind by the working divers that followed Risdon-Beasley to get that 15% that he would have left behind. Divers that physically lifted ingots off the bottom, put them in baskets to have them maybe then lifted to the surface. So there you had it. Koparin still had all of that material left behind simply because, being over 100 feet deeper than Kokosnik, it wasn't practical to put divers down physically recovering the cargo. Koparin today still remains as it was the day Risdon-Beasley left.
You should be in the area of about the number 4 cargo hold.
Roger that, topside.
Cargo hold now.
Roger. Now, I don't know what this material is, but I believe it might be what would be centrifugally spun ingots that would be later machined into bushing.
Look at that, John. That looks like ingots.
I'm pretty sure this is aluminum. Can you see it?
Yeah, we've got that nice and clear.
Well, whatever it is, this stuff is really light. I'm guessing it's aluminum. It looks like loaves of bread.
That's a good one right there.
Yeah, and see how light it is? And I'm not sure what this really bright white stuff is. I guess it's some sort of oxidation on there.
Well, Mike, the visibility's pretty clear. I can almost picture this guy looking out over this wreck from that observation chamber as they blast and grapple and pull this thing apart to get at all this stuff inside.
The valuable hauls of copper, tin, and aluminum fetched Beasley huge sums on the commodity markets. But occasionally, the grab emerged clutching something much less mundane: gold.
It's got to be said that with gold, when you find it, you do feel something. You know it's not yours, you're not going to get any part of it. Perhaps if you're lucky, you might get a bit of a bonus. But there is just something about gold. I've had lots of silver, and that is just more or less like any other cargo you get. But as soon as you see gold, you know it's gold as soon as you see it. You can't help it. You look around, is everybody looking okay? And you just feel, I don't know, apprehensive or whatever. I don't think you feel dishonest yourself, but you just feel different because you know the stuff that you've got in front of you is probably the most valuable stuff you'll ever see in your life.
Risdon Beasley knew that when the press learned of his successes, they would splash inaccurate and exaggerated reports of his operations across every newspaper in Britain. For this reason, Beasley encouraged his employees to keep details of their work to themselves.
Yeah, on the matter of secrecy, I don't know whether Beasley got them to sign, Risdon Beasley himself, that's to say, got them to sign any undertaking not to talk. By the time I got there, it was just a habit. They didn't. And any technique he discovered that worked, he kept to himself, because otherwise competitors might do it. And particularly after the war, there were lots of wrecks in shallow water, lots of wrecks in 100 feet or something all around the UK with decent valuable cargoes on. And there were other salvors who could make a go at that. So it was in his interest to keep very much to himself his technique and his technology.
Another story which really indicates the way that Risdon Beasley operated is the Empire Manor. And this vessel sank right off the coast of Canada, just south of Newfoundland, and it was a gold wreck. I mean, there was a massive amount of gold on this vessel. Beasley sailed in, found the wreck, got the gold off it, got it back to Great Britain, made 85% of the value as his payment, and literally no one was the wiser. He was absolutely remarkable, and this was really a major part of his success.
Sometimes people have said to me, Risdon Beasley wasn't quite as honest as he made out. And I've said, well, why do you think that? And they said, oh, because no one was there to see what he recovered. But I can remember one particular story where, just by chance, a spare propeller came up in the grab, worth a considerable amount of money, I guess. We were told to put it back down in the shipwreck because we had a contract with the Salvage Association on behalf of the underwriters to recover a specific part of that cargo. Anything that came up did not belong to us and was returned.
Jim, I'll swim until I run out of hose.
Hey, Mike, are those propellers on the bottom there?
Yeah, they're definitely propellers, but I'm confused. They're not attached to anything. I need some hose.
Slack the diver.
Can you see there's two spare propellers.
Look at that, John. That's just remarkable. That is a matched pair, Mike. No question about it. Two spare props just sitting right there. And that tells a story about Risdon Beasley. And it certainly matches up with what we were told. If it wasn't on the manifest, he didn't take it. Because, boy, those are just waiting to be grabbed over. If they're as good as they look, that's probably $50,000 or $60,000, Mike, over.
Risdon Beasley must have been quite an interesting character.
Risdon Beasley, the man, was an enigma, private and yet an extremely astute businessman and a good judge of character.
One of the peculiarities of the man was that he didn't like being photographed. And when Alan Crothall wrote a sort of company history after Beasley had died and he wanted to put a photograph in it, he had to call his wife up and ask if she would dig out his old passport, because that was the only photograph that existed of the man. It's the only time it's the only way I know his likeness is a photograph in that book. He was naturally a sort of shy man, but and as I said before, he didn't want to let out the secrets of what he was doing when they were valuable or when they seemed to be valuable. And he just got in the habit of not telling anybody his business. He just chose not to, and that was that. And as I say, he was a majority shareholder. He was one of the last of the old commercial autocrats. He could do what he liked, and that's what he liked doing. And it worked very well. Worked very well for everybody.
Beasley was not a treasure hunter, he was a salvage man. And so many of the treasure hunters, they dream of gold and silver and riches, you know, finding that treasure chest sitting on the bottom with, you know, jewels streaming out of it. And so their motives are totally different. As I say, I look for history. Beasley looked for salvage, and some people look for treasure. And I have noble motives. Beasley had profit motives, and the treasure people, I suppose you could say, in a sense, they have greed motives, you know. So some are successful, some fail miserably. I would say there's probably more money spent looking for treasure than really ever been found.
Mike, that's it. Your time's up, time to go. I'm going to turn you back over to Warren and run you through the deco. We'll talk to you in a bit on your deco.
Okay, we're headed back to the downline. Up on my umbilical.
Yeah, they're up. They're coming up on the hose now, Mike.
Roger, John. Up on the umbilical.
Risdon Beasley's salvage operations ultimately came to an end because there were no more cargoes left to recover at what was then an accessible depth. With all the contracts that he had, Risdon Beasley salvaged more than 80 shipwrecks. There were a few he couldn't get to, a few that were very deep, others whose locations were uncertain and he couldn't find. Other than that, Risdon Beasley pretty much dried up the source of wealth from cargoes of those lost transports that could be reached in his time. Thanks to being in the right place, and thanks to a great deal of hard work in difficult conditions, Risdon Beasley became one of the world's greatest salvagers. What's changed since then is that now we have a technology that enables us to find lost things in the ocean with much greater ease than Risdon Beasley ever had at his disposal. And we have different means of going down to the bottom and salvaging in a different way. We have remotely operated vehicles, we have submersibles, we have a different regimen for deep diving, and all of that now means that what once could not be reached by Risdon Beasley is now available. Salvage has evolved at the beginning of the 21st century, and thanks to new technology, there is no place and no thing that rests in that place at the bottom of the ocean that can't be recovered.
All right, yeah. Good, excellent.
This is Clive Cussler saying, now it's your turn to get up off that couch and go into the deserts, go into the mountains, go under the lakes, the rivers, and the seas, and search for history. You'll never find a more rewarding adventure.
Join us again as we search the oceans of the world for lost and famous shipwrecks. Another true adventure with the Sea Hunters.